They say history is written by the victors. But in the American West, the legends were written in blood, by men who refused to die quietly. By 1876, Jesse James was not just an outlaw. He was a wound that the United States government couldn't close, a man who had turned the chaos of the Civil War into a 10-year campaign of terror and made the entire country watch, helpless, as he did it. The Pinkertons had tried to stop him. They rode hard. They spent millions. They burned his family's farm to the ground. Jesse James was still free. The U.S. Army had tried to track him. They sent their best scouts, their most decorated veterans. Jesse James was still free. Governors had posted bounties. Entire counties were mobilized. Jesse laughed and robbed another bank. In 1876, behind closed doors in Washington, someone finally admitted what everyone already knew. The normal rules did not apply to Jesse James. To catch a man who lived outside the law, they needed someone who stood above it. They didn't send a detective. They didn't send an army. They sent a telegram to the deepest corner of the Texas frontier, to a man whose name people whispered in saloons like a prayer for protection or a curse of doom. His name was never recorded in any official document. History doesn't know his real name. The people who encountered him called him only one thing. He was a Texas Ranger, but not in the way you're thinking. He wasn't a badge and a uniform. He was the archetype of the frontier made flesh, a man with the patience of a stone canyon and eyes that looked right through you, like he was reading something written on the back of your skull. Some historians believe the legend of the Walker is the real origin of everything we now attribute to Chuck Norris, that the almost supernatural stories, the man who doesn't sleep, who doesn't tire, who can't be stopped, they didn't start as jokes. They started as eyewitness accounts from the men who encountered him in Missouri in the winter of 1876. Jesse James felt his arrival before he ever saw a face. This is the story of the final hunt, the confrontation that history was never meant to record. The Missouri wilderness of the 1870s was not a place. It was a labyrinth. Limestone caves that went nowhere, creek beds that split and doubled back, brush so dense that a man could disappear 10 feet off the road and never be found. Jesse James had turned this landscape into his personal fortress over the course of a decade. He knew every cave, every sympathetic farmhouse, every hidden crossing. The Pinkertons had blundered through these woods like a blind giant, snapping branches and shouting orders, giving Jesse miles of warning every single time. The Walker moved differently. He didn't stomp, he didn't shout. He moved like the wind over tall grass, leaving no sound, no disruption, no warning. Where trained detectives had failed for years, the Walker began to make progress in days. Not because he was faster, but because he saw things no one else was looking for. A bent blade of grass half a mile off the road, a stone displaced from its bed in a creek, a bird that took flight at the wrong angle, 1 mile ahead. To the Walker, the wilderness was not silent. It was screaming Jesse James's location. Jesse's scouts began bringing back reports that made even the most hardened gang members go quiet around the campfire. A lone rider who never stopped to eat. A man who passed through towns without speaking and left people unable to lie to the next person who came asking. He looked right through me, one farmer reportedly told Jesse's brother Frank, like he already knew the answer and was just waiting to see if I'd waste his time. Jesse laughed it off, called it another fairy tale cooked up by a desperate governor trying to scare them. But deep down, in the cold corners of his heart, Jesse James already knew. He had spent his entire life as the predator, the one who hunted, who chose, the moment, who controlled the terrain. For the first time, he was the prey. The Walker wasn't just tracking Jesse's movements, he was dismantling the network that kept Jesse invisible. He walked into the homesteads of Confederate sympathizers who had protected Jesse for 10 years, men who had sworn on their graves they would never betray him, and he simply sat at their tables. Didn't threaten, didn't offer money, didn't say much of anything. He just waited with those eyes until the silence became unbearable, and they talked, every single one of them. The Walker wasn't draining the swamp, he was evaporating it, one conversation at a time. Jesse James had survived the Lawrence massacre. He had ridden through a hail of bullets at Northfield, Minnesota, where his entire gang was shredded, and he was the last man out. He had been shot, hunted, betrayed, and every single time he had come back. But this was different. and Jesse could feel it. He started making decisions he never would have made before. Erratic moves, doubling back on his own trails, switching horses every few hours, riding through rivers just to mask his scent, a technique he had never needed to use before because no one had ever been good enough to track it. Every time he climbed to a high ridge to scan the landscape behind him, there it was, a lone silhouette on the horizon, steady, rhythmic, closing the gap with the mechanical patience of a man who understood that the race was already over. He just hadn't told the other person yet. Frank James, the educated one, the reader, the strategist of the gang, tried to reason with his brother. Jesse, it's just a man. A man can be stopped. He had said this about Pinkertons, about sheriffs, about bounty hunters. He had always been right before. Jesse James stared at the horizon for a long time before he answered. "That ain't a man, Frank," he said quietly. "That's a debt coming due." The psychological pressure was doing what 10 years of bullets and bounties had failed to do. It was cracking the legend from the inside. Jesse James had built his entire identity on one foundation, the idea that he could not be cornered, that he was smarter, faster, and more cunning than the system trying to catch him. The Walker was not attacking that identity with force. He was attacking it with patience, the one weapon Jesse had never encountered. Every morning Jesse woke up, and the Walker was still there. Every time Jesse made a move, the Walker adjusted. Every network Jesse relied on was already compromised by the time he arrived. The king of outlaws was running out of kingdom. Jesse James had one move left, and it was a good one. Deep in the Ozark Mountains, in a place locals called the Devil's Elbow, there was a canyon so narrow and so treacherous that a single skilled marksman could hold off an entire regiment. Jesse had used it before. He knew every ledge, every shadow, every angle of fire. He set the trap perfectly. His three best shooters positioned on the cliffs above. Jesse himself standing in the center of the trail, visible, almost inviting, the bait that any lawman would be unable to resist. The plan was simple. Let the Walker ride in, spring the trap, end the myth. As the sun began to set, casting long red streaks across the canyon walls like something biblical, Jesse James waited. He waited. He kept waiting. The Walker never came down the trail. Instead, one of Jesse's shooters on the left cliff simply vanished. No gunshot, no scream, no sound at all, just the wind. Then the second, then the third. Total silence. The Walker had already been inside the canyon when Jesse set the trap. He had circled around, come in from above, and neutralized every single marksman without firing a single shot, while Jesse stood in the center of the trail, waiting for him to walk into the kill zone. Jesse James stood alone in the Devil's Elbow. The trap he had built was now a cage he was standing inside. He fired one shot into the darkness, a reflex, a scream without words, and the only answer was the echo of his own fear coming back at him from the canyon walls. Then, from behind a jagged rock formation, the Walker stepped into the moonlight, 50 paces away. His arms were crossed, his hand wasn't even near his holster. He just stood there, and somehow that was the most terrifying thing Jesse James had ever seen in his life. "You've led a long trail, Jesse." The Walker's voice didn't echo. It absorbed into the canyon walls like it belonged there, flat, certain, final. But every trail ends at a wall. I am that wall. Jesse James had faced death before. He had felt the barrel of a gun against his skull. He had watched friends die inches from him. But standing in that canyon, he felt something he had never felt before, the realization that the story might actually be over. He laughed anyway, because what else do you do? "I've killed men for less than that. Look, Ranger." Jesse's fingers drifted toward the ivory handles of his revolvers, twin Colt single-action army, the guns he had used his entire adult life, the extension of his identity. "You're a long way from Texas." He drew. Jesse James, the fastest drawer in the territory, possibly the fastest drawer alive, went for his guns with the speed of a decade of perfect muscle memory. He never got the hammers back. The Walker moved in a way that seemed to break the rules of space. Not a draw, a lunge. Crossing 50 paces was supposed to be impossible in the time it took a man to pull a trigger. But the Walker wasn't drawing a gun. He was doing something no one in that era had a name for, a precise, devastating kick that connected with Jesse's wrist like a sledgehammer, sending both revolvers spinning into the darkness. Jesse went for his Bowie knife, last resort, guerrilla instinct. He lunged for the throat. The walker parried with a forearm like an iron bar, then a punch to the ribs that sounded, literally, like a tree limb snapping. Then a palm strike to the chest that sent Jesse James, the king of outlaws, flying backward 10 feet into the canyon wall. Jesse lay in the dust, tasting blood, looking up at the silhouette that was blocking out the stars. "Finish it," he whispered. And he meant it. He wanted it to end there. The walker looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached down, grabbed Jesse by the collar with one hand, and lifted him off the ground like he was lifting a coat off. "They hook. You don't get the easy way out," the walker said. "You're going to walk every mile back, and you're going to do it standing up." The journey back from the Ozarks was not a ride. It was a reckoning. The walker tied Jesse's hands with a simple rope, not shackles, not chains, and tethered it to his saddle horn. Jesse walked behind the horse for miles. The man who had never answered to anyone, who had made governments tremble, who had built a legend out of defiance, walked. And Jesse tried everything he had left, his tongue. He spoke about the lost cause, about the widows he had helped, about the corrupt banks that bled the farmers dry, the whole mythology he had spent a decade constructing. He looked for greed in the walker's back, offered him a gold cache from the Gad's Hill robbery, enough to buy a kingdom in Mexico. The walker didn't even turn his head. When they crossed the Missouri River, under a blood-orange moon that looked like it was judging both of them, Jesse finally broke. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the impossible presence of the man in front of him all collapsed at once. "Why you?" Jesse screamed into the wind. "There are 1,000 lawmen in this state. Why did they send a ghost from Texas?" The walker pulled his horse to a stop, turned in the saddle for the first time, and Jesse saw something in his eyes that he hadn't expected. Not hate, not contempt, pity. "They didn't send me to bring you in, Jesse," the walker said, low and steady. "They sent me to see if there was anything left of the man who fought at Wilson's Creek, but all I found was a shadow hiding behind a name." Jesse James, the most famous outlaw in American history, had no answer for that, because it was the first true thing anyone had said to him in years. By the time they reached the outskirts of Jefferson City, something had shifted that could never be put back. Jesse James was no longer looking at the stone walls of the penitentiary with dread. He was looking at them with relief. He wanted the walls. He wanted the bars. He wanted anything that would put something solid between himself and the man from Texas who had looked into his soul and found it empty. But the walker stopped at the gate. He dismounted, walked back to Jesse, cut the rope from his wrists, not handed him to a deputy, not signed a ledger, not waited for anyone, just cut it. Then he pointed toward the lights of the city. "The door is open, Jesse. You can run. Go back to the Yee. Brush. Find Frank. Start the whole thing over again. See if it ends differently." Jesse James stood at the edge of civilization and looked at the darkness of the wilderness behind him. He thought about Frank, about the gold, about the caves he knew better than anyone alive. Then he looked at the walker, who stood with his arms crossed, revolvers still holstered, completely certain of what Jesse was about to do. Jesse James turned his back on the wilderness and walked toward the law. The walker watched until Jesse James disappeared through the gate. Then he turned his horse south toward Texas and faded into the morning mist. He didn't collect the bounty. He didn't want the headlines. He didn't even give his name. He had done what he came to do. The history books tell you that Jesse James died on April 3, 1882, shot in the back by Robert Ford while dusting a picture in his own home. Betrayed by a man he had trusted. A coward's ending for a man who had spent his life demanding a respect. But here's what the history books don't tell you. By 1882, Jesse James was already a ghost. The man who Robert Ford killed, the one hanging picture frames in a suburban house, using a fake name, afraid to wear his guns in public. That man had been gone for years. The walker had already taken him. What Ford killed was just the body. The legend had been broken years before, in a canyon in the Ozarks, by a man whose name never appeared on any official payroll. The real lesson of Jesse James isn't about a man who couldn't be caught. It's about what happens when an unstoppable force finally meets something it cannot comprehend. Not a faster gun, not a bigger army, but an absolute, patient, immovable will. The walker represented something that Jesse James, and the entire era of the Wild West, was not equipped to deal with. Not violence, not law, not even justice exactly. Inevitability. The frontier was wild because it believed that individual will could outrun consequence. Forever. The walker was the proof that it couldn't, that eventually every trail ends at a wall, that the debt always comes due. To this day, in the deepest parts of the Ozark Mountains, hunters talk about a lone rider who appears when the law fails, a man whose boots don't leave tracks, whose silence can be heard for miles. They call him the Frontier's Vengeance. We know him by a different name now, because the man who could not be slowed, could not be bought, and could not be stopped. That archetype didn't die with the frontier. It just found a new century to walk through. Some legends don't end, they just change their boots. That was the walker, the man history forgot, and the legend the frontier never could. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that canyon, then you already understand what Witness of Silence is about. We don't just tell you what happened, we take you inside the moments that the textbooks are afraid to touch. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Share this with someone who still believes in the power of a great story, and leave a comment. Tell me, who should the walker face next? The silence has more stories to tell. I'll see you in the next chapter.